Aloha kako. So as you folks can see, my final paper is still entitled The Last Kanaka, a mo'olelo of forced identity, removal, division, eradication, and genocide. And it's really a history and mo'oku auhau of settler colonialism from the very first English colony in Ireland to Mokuhonu, Turtle Island, to our ancestral home here in Hawaii. It's also about how these events intersect and overlap abuses to create trauma across generations, as well as a structure built on the demise of our people to the advantage of the white settler state. And I feel it is necessary to disclose that I am also Indigenous Gaelic Irish and a descendant of the Blackfoot-speaking peoples of the Montana area of Mokuhonu on my paternal side. And while I do not identify with that side, this paper is a way for me to honor their past and present struggles for land, culture, language, and people. What have I discovered since our midterm? First, I discovered I can't stay within the maximum page count to save my life. Mary is currently 2 pages over the limit, and I have left so much information out. But aside from that, I finished 2 books this semester for my research, the first being Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. It's her latest book that was released just this past year. She also authored an Indigenous Peoples History of the U.S. The second puke I finished is by David E. Stannard, who is a retired professor of American Studies at UH Manoa, and he was also the partner to Auntie Haunaniki Trask. His book is entitled American Holocaust, Columbus, and the Conquest of the New World. He's authored a few other books, one of which is entitled Before the Horror, The Population of Hawaii on the Eve of Western Contact. Dunbar Ortiz's chapter on Irish settling allowed me to understand the transition from being oppressed and marginalized to becoming a settler in the context of forced identity, ethnocide, removal, and assimilation, committed against the Irish in the 12th century with the Anglo-Norman invasion in 1169. But still earlier yet with the arrival of Christianity in the 5th and 6th centuries to the sweeping and forced famines of the 19th century. Really, the West has been perfecting the mechanisms of colonialism for nearly 900 years, a devastating reality when one stops to ponder its origins. Stannard's book goes into detail about the brutal treatment of Irish and Native Turtle Islanders by Spanish and British exterminationists. And I use the term exterminationism and exterminationist throughout my paper to refer to the policies and sentiments of Euro-American settlers created to remove Indigenous presence, Native Turtle Islanders, Kanako Iwi, and Irish from their ancestral lands and lifeways. Indeed, the history of genocide has within its written records countless applications of the word exterminate by individuals like Andrew Jackson, William Tecumseh Sherman in his letter to Ulysses S. Grant in 1873, which I mentioned in my midterm presentation, to George Washington's quote-unquote War of Extermination in 1783, even to Abraham Lincoln's mass hanging of 38 hand-picked Dakota natives, which still to this day remains the largest mass execution in U.S. history. It is unbelievable how many times the word exterminate comes up in these texts, newspaper articles, and letters. My paper has 3 level 1 subheadings. It originally had 4, but I decided to merge intersectionality and experience. My first subheading is settler colonialism, my second intersectionality and experience, and the last is Oiwi survivance, which acts as my conclusion since Mary is already 2 pages over my limit, as is aforementioned. I combined my second and third subheading because as I was typing out my thoughts and citing my work, I realized that these were experiences and recollections of existing in 2 or more historically oppressed groups. And as I referenced the categorical injuries and injustices, it became apparent that we experience intersectionality. So I brought the 2 subheadings together, but only time will tell if it worked out for the better. So I am obsessed with using epigraphs. And I was kind of going back and forth between using an Olelo no Iao to using one that I found within one of the books I read. When it came down to making the decision, however, I chose Adrienne Keene's quote, which came from her work in The Great Vanishing Act, Blood Quantum, and the Future of Native Nations, which also has within it an essay written by an Oiwi scholar. It's a must-have on your decolonized bookshelf. But I felt her words captured everything my essay attempts to highlight and the understanding of survivance despite contemporary maneuverings to see us annihilated through policy, law, and blatant forced removal and relocation. My first subheading, Settler Colonialism, deals with the idea of manifest destiny and its mechanisms which are employed by the invasive settler state and its invaders to exterminate the indigenous populations and place the settler state in the stead of the original inhabitants, whether through complete annihilation or assimilation. And because removal and disappearance of indigenous bodies of the desired area is so central to settler colonialism and certainly relies upon it, the chief means to meet that end is through extermination. Thus, the reason I use exterminationist and exterminationism throughout my paper to describe those who are involved in that brutal practice. So pictured here is a depiction of manifest destiny and divine providence, where white disease-ridden colonists are guided by an angel of civilization or Lady Columbia, who brings light to the darkness and impure nature of the savage beast of indigenous stock. It also allows us to question how we view darkness in relation to light. And as I mentioned in my third impact paper, we are at home in darkness. It was the guise of purity and light that destroyed us. I choose to return to pole. And when we understand the truth in our realities and experiences and allow ourselves to exist in the beautiful darkness, the narrative begins to shift. Light is merely an ideological form of destruction. It brings with it mass death and enslavement, past, present, and future. This portrayal of the coming of Euro-American murderers, thieves, rapists, and sadistic enslavers reveals the true nature of providence. In Stefancic and Delgado's work, A Critical Race Theory, an Introduction, its third edition, intersectionality is described as, begin quote, the examination of race, sex, class, national origin, and sexual orientation, and how their combination plays in various settings. These categories can be separate, disadvantaging factors, end quote. The authors pose the question about existing in more than one historically oppressed category. For example, being a woman in this heteropatriarchal Christian white society is bad enough. But if you're indigenous and Wahine, what happens then? Abuses and injury are now twofold, and justice is merely wishful thinking. I also use Tivita Kaili's Tava time-space theory to illuminate how intersectionality rides along the spatial-temporal continuum he talks about in his book to connect past traumatic experiences with current and future realities of marginalization and attempted eradication. I also mention epigenetics as a validation of this idea because structural violence also plays a role in how we experience trauma and how our genes respond to the oppressive environment constructed, which in turn affects our behaviors and cognitive abilities to function and process everyday aggressions by the settler state. Essentially, it's about intergenerational and historical trauma. So this is my favorite slide and subheading. I first read about survivance in Kanako Oiwi methodologies, Mo'olelo, and metaphor, which then led me to this individual, Gerald Robert Viziner, who is of Anishinaabe descent. And because I will never be able to capture the same eloquency as he has in his description of survivance, I'd like to end with a passage from his work, Survivance, Narratives of Native Presence. Begin quote. The nature of survivance is unmistakable in Native stories, natural reason, remembrance, traditions, and customs, and is clearly observable in Native resistance and personal attributes, such as the Native humanistic tease, vital irony, spirit, cast of mind, and moral courage. The character of survivance creates a sense of Native presence over absence, nihility, and victimry. Native survivance is an active sense of presence over absence, deracination, and oblivion. Survivance is the continuance of stories, not a mere reaction, however pertinent. Survivance is greater than the right of a survivable name. Survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, detractions, obtrusions, the unbearable sentiments of tragedy, and the legacy of victimry. Survivance is the heritable right of succession or reversion of an estate and, in the course of international declarations of human rights, is a narrative estate of Native survivance.